I'm Catherine Reid, host of the St. Paul Forum, and coming up next, I'm speaking with musician Larry Long about the tribute concert he's organizing to celebrate the life of Pete Seeger. That's next on the St. Paul Forum. Hi, I'm Catherine Reid, host of the St. Paul Forum, and joining me today is Larry Long, musician extraordinaire. Larry, welcome. So glad you could make it. So you have loved Pete Seeger for a long time, and we're talking about the concert that's going to honor him. Tell us about how you got to know Pete Seeger.
It was a really roundabout way. I was singing for farmers trying to stop a high voltage power line in central Minnesota. And this was back in the 1970s. And a farmer named Virgil Fuchs invited me to go sing at the American Agriculture Movement strike office. And that was in Appleton, Minnesota. And he wanted me to sing a song about the power line fight and also a song for family farmers to build a coalition between the different self-interest of family farmers in Minnesota. So when I arrived in the strike office in Appleton and I sang, there was the old governor of Minnesota, farmer labor governor Elmer Benson. And Elmer Benson, who I had never met before and didn't know much about either, he happened to be in the strike office and he was still living. And when I got done singing, he said, "You remind me of Woody Guthrie and Pete Seeger." And I said, "Who are you?" And then he told me that he used to be the governor after Floyd B. Olson. And he talked about Woody and Pete coming to Minnesota singing for striking lumberjacks and miners. And he got to know them. And so unbeknownst to me, Elmer Benson called up Pete Seeger and told him about me. And so there was a tractorcade that was organized through the American Agriculture Movement. And I went on that, and it was a 100-mile-long tractorcade, farmers from across the United States to the capital.
To the capital of Minnesota, St. Paul?
No,
to the capital,
Washington, D.C.
To Washington, D.C. I just wanted to get us geographically, yeah.
It was a slow and a long trip, and it was in the heart of winter. So when we arrived in Washington, D.C., I got a phone call from Pete Seeger in the strike office, and he said, "I want to meet you." And he invited me to his house.
Fabulous. And that was the beginning of a long relationship between you, Pete, and his wife also.
His wife, Toshi.
Toshi.
Yes. That was over 40 years ago. So.
Yeah, a long time.
Yeah.
Can you talk just for general purposes about the tradition of music that Pete, Woody, and now you represent?
Woody Guthrie and Pete Seeger are cut from the same cloth, but two very uniquely different people. Woody Guthrie was a mentor to Pete Seeger. Woody Guthrie was older than Pete. And Pete was in his early 20s when he met Woody, and he was a bit older. And so Woody Guthrie took Pete Seeger under his wing, and they began to travel around the United States. And Woody Guthrie really helped Pete Seeger cut his teeth and in terms of singing on the streets for people and going off and singing at rallies in rural America and so forth, out to Oklahoma, California. Pete was more based in New York and New York City, so he comes from more of a New England tradition of intellectuals, whereas Woody Guthrie comes from, well, his family was very well educated, people from Okemo, Oklahoma, but he really represented the singer that sang for the working people, for the farmers, specifically the Dust Bowl refugees, and those fighting for parity and the end of foreclosures of the family farm. And then together they fought for the labor movement. And then Pete Seeger kind of took the tradition a step farther. Woody Guthrie documented the struggles of the people in song. But what Pete Seeger began to do is he began to bring the singing into community organizing. And he began to merge community organizing skills with the art of singing and entertaining people with intentionality of a purpose to make the world better for others. So from Pete Seeger, with the clear water, he built a gaff rig sloop on the Hudson River to clean up the whole river. He also did a lot of work with the Highlander Folk School, and that's where he brought the song "We Shall Overcome" to the Civil Rights Movement. He was there with Dr. King, Rosa Parks, Dr. Abernathy.
So this belief that the power of a song to help people decide to act, can you talk a little bit more about how you see that working?
Well, what Pete, really believed in strongly was if people can sing together, they can work together. And so it's not that a song is the end all. It's, music and art should be rooted in community, and that it's a circle. Community is circular, and music and faith and belief comes out of this circle of relationship. So what music does and art does, it helps in the best of moments. It helps to bring together the best of our intentions as a community of people that cares for generations to come, and also the generations that are coming up behind us.
And so Pete's tradition has carried on for a long time. He was active. I mean, he died in January.
Yeah, it was this winter. He
This
passed
winter,
away.
yeah.
Yeah.
And his music was still very alive. Can you speak to a little bit about what's been important about that?
Well, I mean, Pete Seeger never quit singing, and he never quit writing. He wrote up until his dying day, and he kept, not just writing songs, but journaling and reading. And he was a master of letters. He wrote thousands and thousands of letters to people that wrote to him daily. His box office was filled with hundreds of letters, and he would, his wife Toshi, through all these years, would help separate the letters. He helped prioritize the letters, and he would often write in the margins of letters of people that would reach out to him and for support. And he was vigilant about keeping communication going with ordinary folk. And Pete, I have had the opportunity to meet people who are quite well known and famous, and not many of them impressed me much, but Pete Seeger really impressed me. Mm-hmm. Pete Seeger was the real thing. He was not enamored by fame, but he was wise enough to know how to use fame for the interest of the people and the common good. Not so much for himself, but really he was empowered by the strength of others, and he in turn empowered them in song. It was this relationship, and that's the tradition I try to walk in, and I'm in agreement with it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So we're going to come back to talking a little bit about your relationship to it. Let's talk briefly about this concert because it's coming right up. It's an opportunity for people to celebrate his life and to sing along with you. But tell us about what made you decide to do the concert and when it is and who will be there.
Well, when I heard about Pete Seeger's passing, and it was difficult, of course. But when you're 94 years old like Pete, none of us are here forever. So, and I was with him last October and last November. And so when Pete passed away, I immediately posted on Facebook. I said, why don't people around the world organize a For Pete's Sake celebration on Pete Seeger's 95th birthday? And we'll do it in small ways and big ways all around the world to honor the legacy of Pete Seeger, rooted in social and environmental justice. I ended up getting responses from Norway, Israel, from all of the United States. And as a matter of fact, there are celebrations in Norway and Israel and across the United States on May 3rd. So I also had people write to me wanting to do events for Pete Seeger. And I said, no, I need to do one on May 3rd. And so I immediately got busy and I contacted St. Joan of Arc Church and then realized the dream of this was much bigger. So I contacted the Fitzgerald and Minnesota Public Radio and I booked it. And I'm the one that signed the dotted line and it's taken a bit of a financial risk and gamble on it. But my gut from the beginning is that this is going to work out. And in fact, it is working out. So at the Fitzgerald, I reached out to many people, Prudence Johnson, Tim Frantic, Ann Reid, Dan Chenard, Robert Robertson, Tanya Hughes, Cameron Wright.
They all said
There's
yes.
like 60
Yeah.
Artists and narrators are going to be a part of it. So they all said yes, and so before we know it, now it's 2 weeks away, and we've sold about 2/3 of the Fitzgerald.
Great. If you're just joining us, I'm talking with Larry Long, musician, about a concert that's coming up at the Fitzgerald to celebrate Pete Seeger. So one of the things that captured my imagination about the concert is you do want to continue this tradition of singing. We're going to come and sing with you. Is that right?
Yeah. Well, what I've done is I've written and compiled a 2-act script. It's going to be a play.
Oh.
And so there's narration, and Dale Connolly is going to be doing some of the narration, and Sharon Sells Belton and others. And so these are Pete Seeger's spoken words and written words, and I've compiled them. And these narrations are going to bridge into the songs that Pete Seeger either wrote or popularized through his years of singing, with an emphasis on the civil rights movement and 1963, the freedom schools that emerged out of that and so forth. So that's how it's going to go. And it's not going to be one of these, the concert is going to move really like a 2-act play, but it's going to begin with films by William Eigen, who has done 3 documentaries on Pete Seeger. You know, the most recent is Pete and Toshi Got a Camera, about their travels around the world during the McCarthy era with their children, The Power of Song, and The Weavers. So he's put together a 10-minute piece and an 8-minute piece. So as people come in to the theater, they're going to actually be watching, movies and films of Pete performing.
Great. So they'll really connect. I want to talk just a little bit about what you think is the way his legacy is carried on. How do you see it showing up in terms of current activism? Who's carrying that torch forward in addition to you of this tradition of using song?
I mean, one is by the hundreds and hundreds of responses from the Facebook, it shows that people's love for Pete Seeger. Also, the fact is, I felt very close to Pete Seeger, but thousands of others feel the same closeness because Pete really validated younger people coming up. Pete Seeger was a very intergenerational person. Pete always really served as the role of an elder, in the true sense of the word, that he really nurtured young people coming up, and it would kind of guide people into to the best of intentions and calling. So to me, whenever there's intergenerational work done and community building, that's the spirit of Pete Seeger. Whenever people come together in small ways or large ways, be it a campfire, a church gathering, or a labor rally, and people are singing, well, that's Pete Seeger's spirit is living. Specifically close to home, I worked on the Clearwater Project on the Hudson, and I brought the Clearwater effort to the Mississippi River back in 1980. And we built a movement called the Mississippi River Revival. And in 1980, Pete Seeger and myself performed at the World Theater, which is the Fitzgerald, as a fundraiser for the Mississippi River Revival and Sing Out magazine. Well, out of the Mississippi River Revival, grew the whole Clean Rivers effort in Minnesota. Every year, you hear about people clean up streams and rivers.
Right.
Well, that got started from us, because Governor Perpich studied our work cleaning up the Mississippi River locally. He then incorporated it with the DNR. The DNR then passed the
Department of Natural Resources, right? Yep.
And then they passed the baton on to all these civic organizations. So all these river cleanups you see
Which will be happening this time of year, if I'm not
are
mistaken.
directly tied to Pete Seeger. And out of the Mississippi River Revival grew Friends of the Mississippi. That grew out of a lawsuit. Friends of the Mississippi grew out of a lawsuit from a pollution sources that Mississippi River Revival discovered, and then the baton was passed on to them as the recipients of that. So that's Pete Seeger. There ain't nobody in the whole wide world like Pete. Ain't nobody in the whole wide world like Pete. Ain't nobody in the whole wide world like each and every boy and girl. Ain't nobody in the whole wide world like Pete. For Pete's sake, keep those rivers clean. The Volga, Yangtze, Amazon, Hudson, and Mississippi. Why, there ain't nobody in the whole wide world like Pete. Repeat. Ain't nobody in the whole wide world like Pete. Ain't nobody in the whole wide world like each and every boy and girl. Ain't nobody in the whole wide world like Pete. For Pete's sake, find a place that you just love to be. Stick with it, care for it. The whole wide world depends on it. All it takes is one good song to help this world sing along. Ain't nobody in the whole wide world like Pete. Repeat. Ain't nobody in the whole wide world like Pete. Ain't nobody in the whole wide world like each and every boy and girl. Ain't nobody in the whole wide world like Pete. Sail away. Sail away, sail on clear water. Sail away. Sail away, sail on clear water. There ain't nobody in the whole wide world like Pete. Song for Pete Seeger.
So that power of inspiration to help people lead. Yeah. Let's talk just briefly about the work you currently do, because the way you do your work is also carrying on that tradition of the elder and young people creating music that's meaningful. Can you just describe it briefly?
Yeah, I'd love to. Actually, out of the Mississippi River Revival, when I was organizing that for 10 years, with music and festivals, I truly discovered the power of song. Because with intentionality brought together community performers with regional and national artists for the betterment of the Mississippi River that we all share. And from that, I got invited to sing in Oklahoma. And when I sang in Oklahoma, I was asked if I would be willing to bring the tradition of Woody Guthrie back home to the state of Oklahoma through the Oklahoma State Arts Board. And I said I'd never worked with kids before, but I would love to do it. And so I essentially began to travel into Oklahoma 2 months a year, working in schools, and I discovered that I would much rather be writing songs with children than coming in and doing a lecture about who Woody Guthrie was. So I created this program, Elder Wisdom Children's Song, that first began through collective songwriting with kids, going home and talking to their parents, bringing back what they find from their parents into the classroom, then writing songs to honor their community. And then out of that, I circled into Okemah, Oklahoma, Woody Guthrie's hometown. And we brought Woody Guthrie home through this process. I got children in Okemah to interview their parents, bring their stories in. We wrote music, and then we held a huge celebration at the Crystal Theater where Woody Guthrie performed. And then that got international news. The Wall Street Journal hailed it as the end of the Cold War in America. Okemah welcomes Woody Guthrie home. Well, people in Alabama heard about this work, brought me into a think tank in Colorado. They said, we think what you're doing is important. And then we decided we were going to celebrate the diversity of rural Alabama communities without using the word diversity, because the political right, if they hear words like humanities and diversity, they'll target that at school board meetings and will shut it down. So we began using a language that would be palatable to all people. So the word elder is a word that all nations of people respect. So with that, with intentionality, they brought me into Alabama to work in 27 rural communities where we brought together predominantly Scottish, Irish, and African American elders into communities that have been fighting for integration for years. And we used Elder Wisdom Children's Song as a bridge to bring these different cultures together to talk about difficult subjects, courageous conversation through song and narrative. The success of that led into a nonprofit called Community Celebration of Place. So now in the Twin Cities, we've written over 300 songs for elders of every continent of the world that call Minnesota home.
And really engage students in discovering their own creative potential, because I've seen you with the children, and when they sing those songs to the elders, it's one of the most amazing experiences that you can have. You see this incredible honoring, but you see the joy and the understanding children have of someone whose life is almost unimaginable to them. It's a really exciting process, and I encourage people to explore it. So when you coming back to this day in the concert and coming back to the power of song, what's your hope that people will carry out the door with them after this concert is over? What do you hope that experience is for the people who join you both in the hall and maybe afterward?
Well, I think all good work comes with intentionality, and there's limits to what we can all do. But the concert is a very multicultural celebration of artists in Minnesota without any one clear majority of complexion or shade of skin or culture. The people doing narration, there's no one clear majority of dominance. So essentially the concert is a way to really try to personify the rainbow race that Pete Seeger dreamed about and wants this world to be. And so it's an attempt to personify the dream, because in fact, heaven is here right now if we wish to claim it. And so May 3rd is a moment of which I'm trying to claim a slice of heaven on earth, of the best of intentions of who we are from Minnesota. And we're so much larger as a people than we often get a chance to celebrate. So people are going to walk out of the event thinking, I've never been to anything quite like this before. And also, once people can see something, it's not too hard for them to begin to imagine something even more so or better than this. So it's a process of community organizing with celebration. We're hoping to raise a large chunk of money for one little Children's Defense Fund Freedom School in Minneapolis. In Pete's spirit of thinking globally but working locally. And if we can make a little difference in this little Freedom School in South Minneapolis through an event that is not star-studded, but with regional artists, we can show that this can be replicated by others. So that's another outgrowth.
Yeah, that would be fabulous.
Yeah.
And so people can still pick up tickets.
Yeah, they can.
And so we'll encourage people to call the Fitzgerald, get their tickets for May 3rd. And
They can get it at Ticketmaster too.
okay.
But I urge them to go to the Fitzgerald Theater because you don't get the extra charges.
Right. And if they're so inclined, they can also support Pete's work by supporting the Freedom School. If they want to write an extra check, there'll be an opportunity for that.
Yeah, there will be.
And so we thank you so much for what you're doing, and come join us again next week on the St. Paul Forum.